Jaclyn Dioro. In the spring of 2025, a 31-year-old woman from Brick Township, New Jersey, turned to a dating app not for romance, but for murder. Jaclyn Dioro had grown consumed by rage. Her relationship had ended, her ex-partner had moved on, and a custody battle over their shared life had pulled in lawyers, judges, and a police officer she blamed for tipping the scales against her. Rather than accept the outcome, Dioro decided she would eliminate everyone standing in her way. She opened Tinder not looking for a date, but for a weapon. Word had spread in certain corners of the internet that the app could be used to find people willing to do dangerous, illegal things for the right price. Dioro began swiping with a singular purpose, and eventually she matched with someone who seemed to fit the profile she was searching for. The man on the other end of the conversation presented himself as exactly what she needed. He was not. He was an undercover law enforcement officer, and from the moment their conversation began, every word was being recorded. Over the following weeks, Dioro grew increasingly comfortable with her newfound contact. She believed she had found her solution, and in that false sense of security, she began to talk. She talked about her ex-partner, about his new girlfriend, about the police officer she wanted removed from her life entirely. She did not speak in vague terms or hint at her intentions. Investigators later revealed that she laid out specific timelines for when the killings should happen, named the locations where her targets could be found, and negotiated payment plans for the hits she was ordering. 3 lives, she believed, could be erased for the right price, and she was prepared to pay it. What Dioro did not know was that every detail she shared was being documented as evidence. The undercover officer let her talk, let her plan, let her believe that her murder-for-hire scheme was moving forward exactly as she wanted it to. In reality, she was building the very case that would be used against her in court. When the operation reached its conclusion, Dioro was arrested and charged with attempted murder for hire, a charge carrying severe penalties under New Jersey law. She entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for a trial that would force prosecutors to present the recorded conversations as evidence of her intent. As of 2025, her case remains in the pre-trial phase, with the recordings expected to play a central role should the matter proceed to a jury. What makes Dioro's case especially unsettling is not just the audacity of using a dating app to solicit murder, but the calculated nature of her planning. She did not act in a single moment of rage. She built a plan, vetted what she believed was a hired killer, and discussed logistics with the same casual detail someone might use to plan a vacation. Her targets included not only her ex-partner and his new girlfriend, but a police officer whose only crime, in her eyes, was doing his job during a custody dispute. The case remains pending, but it stands as a chilling reminder that modern technology, designed to connect people, can just as easily become a tool for those determined to destroy lives. Antuinet Pelzer. On a spring afternoon in May of 2012, 2 women from Canada walked along Pacific Avenue in Atlantic City, New Jersey, enjoying what should have been an ordinary day of sightseeing. 80-year-old Joan and her 47-year-old daughter, Alice Mackey Leong, had no way of knowing that their visit to the famous boardwalk city would end in violence before nightfall. 46-year-old Antuinet Pelzer approached the 2 tourists with robbery on her mind. She carried a butcher knife with a 13-inch blade, a weapon chosen for its capacity to do serious damage. When she confronted Joan and Leong, demanding their belongings, the 2 women did not comply quietly. Whether out of fear, instinct, or simple refusal to be victimized, they resisted her demands. That resistance triggered an explosion of violence that neither woman could have anticipated. Pelzer turned the knife on them both. Leong was stabbed in the upper body, wounds that would prove fatal. Her elderly mother Joan, rather than fleeing the scene, attempted to shield her daughter from the attack, placing herself directly in the path of the blade. Pelzer stabbed her multiple times as well. Both women collapsed on the sidewalk, victims of a robbery that had turned into a double homicide in a matter of moments. By chance, a police officer was patrolling nearby and arrived at the scene quickly enough to apprehend Pelzer before she could flee. The officer's swift action meant there was no lengthy manhunt, no months of uncertainty for investigators. Pelzer was taken into custody at the location of the crime, the knife and the blood on her clothing speaking to what had just occurred. Both Joan and her daughter Leong succumbed to their injuries, leaving behind a family in Canada that had lost 2 generations of women to a senseless act of violence thousands of miles from home. The case moved through the New Jersey court system over the following year, with prosecutors building a case anchored by the officer's eyewitness account and physical evidence collected at the scene. On August 30, 2013, Pelzer entered a guilty plea, sparing the families the ordeal of a lengthy trial, but ensuring that her culpability would be a matter of permanent legal record. On October 24, 2013, she was sentenced to 80 years in prison, 40 years for each victim, ordered to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The sentencing reflected the severity of taking 2 lives in a single brutal episode, and effectively guaranteed that Pelzer would spend the remainder of her natural life behind bars. Today, Pelzer remains incarcerated at Edna Mayan Correctional Facility, where she will likely die without ever again knowing freedom. Her case is remembered not only for its senseless brutality, but for the devastating image of a mother throwing herself between her daughter and a knife, only for both of their lives to be cut short on a boardwalk afternoon in Atlantic City. Celestine Payne. Between 1991 and 1995, in Paterson, New Jersey, a woman named Celestine Payne built one of the coldest and most calculating insurance fraud schemes the state had ever seen, one that left a trail of dead and wounded bodies in its wake. What set Payne apart from other killers was not rage or jealousy, but pure financial greed, executed with chilling, methodical patience over the better part of a decade. The scheme began in 1991, when Payne made the decision to murder her own husband. She poisoned him, ending his life in their home, and then turned to an unthinkable resource to dispose of the evidence: her own children and an autistic tenant named Eugene Cooper. Together, they helped her get rid of her husband's body, ensuring that no immediate suspicion would fall on her. The payout from his life insurance policy came to $39,000, money that Payne collected without anyone questioning the true cause of his death. 2 years later, in 1993, Payne turned her attention to Eugene Cooper himself, the same vulnerable man who had helped her conceal her husband's body. She took out a fraudulent insurance policy in his name, then arranged to have him stabbed, intending to collect on his death as well. Cooper survived the attack, but Payne was not finished trying to profit from his suffering. In a particularly chilling act of deception, she impersonated his mother in order to sign a do not resuscitate order, attempting to ensure that medical staff would withhold the very treatment that might save his life. Cooper lived, but Payne's scheme had one more victim still to come. In 1995, Payne orchestrated her most elaborate deception yet. She had her own daughter pose as an 18-year-old named Tara Carter in order to fraudulently obtain another insurance policy. Once the policy was secured, Payne arranged to have the real Tara Carter killed. Her body was later discovered dumped in East Side Park, the final piece of a 4-year pattern of murder and mutilated trust that had cost lives for nothing more than a payout. Payne was finally arrested in 1997, years after her first killing, once investigators began connecting the threads between the insurance claims, the disposed bodies, and the strange web of impersonation she had constructed. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she pled guilty rather than risk a trial. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms, a punishment reflecting both the calculated nature of her crimes and the sheer number of lives she had destroyed or attempted to destroy along the way. Decades later, in March of 2025, Payne, now in her 70s, was considered for parole. Her request was denied, the parole board apparently unmoved by her age or the years already served. She remains incarcerated to this day, a woman whose pursuit of insurance money cost one life outright, endangered another, and ended in the brutal killing of a teenager who had done nothing more than have her identity stolen for profit. Kathleen Dorset. In Camden County, New Jersey, a divorce that should have ended with paperwork and a clean break instead ended in gunfire on a summer day in July of 2010. Kathleen Dorset had spent years nursing a resentment toward her ex-husband, Stephen Moore, a bitterness that festered long after their marriage had legally dissolved. For Dorset, the divorce was never truly over. The financial obligations tied to their separation gnawed at her, growing into something far darker than ordinary post-divorce frustration. On July 6, 2010, that resentment reached its breaking point. Dorset did not act in a sudden fit of rage triggered by a single argument or a chance encounter. Investigators would later determine that her actions were premeditated, a plan carried out with deliberate intent rather than impulsive anger. She armed herself and traveled to the location where she knew she would find more, carrying with her the weapon she intended to use and the resolve to use it. When she found him, Dorset opened fire, shooting Moore multiple times in an attack that left no question about her intent to kill. There was no struggle that escalated unexpectedly, no claim of self-defense that could explain the number of times she pulled the trigger. This was an execution born from years of simmering anger over money, obligation, and the lingering ties that divorce had failed to sever. The investigation that followed methodically dismantled any possibility of Dorset escaping accountability. Forensic ballistics experts matched the weapon used in the shooting to evidence tied directly to Dorset. Witnesses who had seen her in the area or who knew of her ongoing disputes with Moore provided testimony that painted a clear picture of motive and opportunity. Cell phone records placed her at the scene and traced her movements in the lead-up to the killing, while financial records laid bare the exact obligations and resentments that investigators believed had driven her to murder. Faced with this mounting body of evidence, Dorset's case proceeded to trial rather than ending in a plea deal. A jury heard the combined weight of ballistics, eyewitness accounts, phone records, and financial documentation and found her guilty of the murder of Stephen Moore. In 2012, she was sentenced to 58 years in prison, a term that, given her age at sentencing, amounted to a de facto life sentence. She would grow old and likely die behind bars long before any possibility of release. Dorset remains incarcerated in New Jersey today, her case standing as a stark reminder of how unresolved post-divorce conflict, when left to fester for years, can ultimately erupt into deadly violence. What began as a dispute over money and obligation ended with a man dead and a woman who will spend the rest of her life paying for the choice she made on that July day. Sherry Lee Hefernon. In March of 2021, in the quiet coastal town of Surf City, New Jersey, a long-simmering family conflict over property and inheritance exploded into a double homicide that shocked the small community. Sherry Lee Hefernon, 55 years old, had spent years locked in disputes with her elderly father over the fate of the family home, a conflict that would ultimately cost two people their lives. At the center of the dispute was John Hefernon, Sherry's 87-year-old father, who had made plans to sell the property that had likely been in the family for years. For Sherry, the sale represented more than just a real estate transaction. She viewed it as a direct threat to her inheritance, a loss of something she may have believed was rightfully hers to claim eventually. Compounding her resentment was her father's girlfriend, 75-year-old Francois Pitoy, whose presence in John's life Sherry seemed to view as a dangerous influence, steering her father's decisions away from her own interests. The tension between Sherry, her father, and his girlfriend built for an unknown period before finally reaching its violent conclusion. On March 22, 2021, Sherry Hefernon arrived at the property armed with both a knife and a firearm, weapons that left little doubt about the level of premeditation behind what she was about to do. She attacked both her father and Francois Pitoy in a brutal assault that left no survivors. Both elderly victims died as a result of the attack. Their lives ended over a dispute about a house and the money it represented. The investigation that followed left little room for ambiguity about Sherry's guilt. Blood evidence collected at the scene tied her directly to the violence. Fingerprint analysis placed her at the location during the time of the killings. Forensic examination of the weapons used in the attack matched the wounds suffered by both victims. Beyond the physical evidence, text messages retrieved from Sherry's phone revealed the depth of her anger and her stated intentions in the lead-up to the killings, while financial records illustrated exactly what was at stake for her in the dispute over her father's property. With evidence spanning forensics, digital communication, and financial motive all pointing toward her guilt, Sherry Lee Hefernon was convicted of the murders of her father and his girlfriend. The court sentenced her to 2 consecutive life terms, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to inherit the property she had killed to protect, nor any other freedom for the remainder of her life. She remains incarcerated today, a daughter who chose violence over acceptance when faced with the prospect of losing what she believed should have been hers. Naomi Elkins. In October of 2024, in Lakewood, New Jersey, a mother's mind unraveled in a way that would end with the deaths of her 2 young sons, and a case that forced the justice system to confront the painful intersection of mental illness and unimaginable tragedy. Naomi Elkins, 27 years old, worked as a daycare worker, spending her days caring for other people's children, even as something inside her own mind began to break apart. The 2 victims in this case were Elkins's own toddler sons, boys whose names were never publicly disclosed, likely in an effort to protect what remained of the family's privacy in the aftermath of an unspeakable loss. On the day of the killings, Elkins drowned both of her young sons in their own home, an act that investigators and mental health professionals would later determine was not born of cruelty or malice, but of a mind that had completely detached from reality. In the aftermath of the killings, Elkins spoke about religious motivations behind her actions, statements that struck investigators and clinicians as deeply inconsistent with any rational understanding of the world around her. Her words pointed not toward calculated violence, but toward acute psychosis, a severe break from reality that had apparently convinced her that drowning her children was somehow justified or necessary within a delusional framework only she could see. As the case moved forward, multiple mental health experts were brought in to evaluate Elkins's psychological state, both at the time of the killings and in the months that followed. Their conclusions were unanimous. Every expert who examined her agreed that she had been experiencing a severe psychiatric break at the time she drowned her sons, a break so profound that she was unable to distinguish right from wrong in the moment she acted. This unanimous agreement among mental health professionals would prove decisive in how the case was ultimately resolved. In April of 2025, the court found Naomi Elkins not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that acknowledged both the deaths of her 2 sons and the undeniable psychiatric crisis that had driven her to cause them. Rather than facing traditional criminal sentencing, Elkins was committed to a secure psychiatric facility for a period of 150 years, broken down as 75 years for each of her sons, with the terms running concurrently rather than consecutively. Though technically a psychiatric commitment rather than a prison sentence, the length and structure of her commitment make release virtually impossible for the remainder of her natural life. Naomi Elkins will likely spend the rest of her days within the walls of a secure psychiatric institution, a daycare worker who once cared for the children of others, ultimately undone by a break from reality that cost her own 2 sons their lives. Ruth Direnzo Whitehead. On April 10, 2023, in Horsham, Pennsylvania, 51-year-old Ruth Direnzo Whitehead committed an act so contrary to a mother's instinct to protect her child that it left investigators and the public struggling to comprehend what had driven her to it. The victim was her own son, Matthew Whitehead, a young man whose life ended at his mother's hands in their family home. Direnzo Whitehead used a belt to kill her son, a method that spoke to the desperate, almost improvised nature of the act, rather than any long-planned scheme involving weapons or poison. What emerged in the aftermath of the killing was a portrait of a woman crushed under the weight of severe financial desperation, her mind warped by distorted thinking that had convinced her she was somehow protecting her son rather than destroying him. She believed, in some twisted reasoning shaped by her desperation, that she was sparing Matthew from future suffering, a delusion that allowed her to rationalize an unthinkable act as a form of mercy. After killing her son, Direnzo Whitehead did not stay in Pennsylvania. She got into her car and drove toward Wildwood Crest, New Jersey, crossing state lines in the hours following the killing. Whether she was fleeing from what she had done, searching for some kind of resolution, or simply unable to process the reality of her actions, her journey ended when police in New Jersey took her into custody, far from the home where Matthew had died. Because the killing itself had occurred in Pennsylvania, Direnzo Whitehead was returned to face trial in Montgomery County, the jurisdiction with authority over the crime. the case moved through the Pennsylvania court system, with prosecutors presenting evidence of both the killing itself and the financial pressures that had apparently driven her to it. In February of 2024, she was convicted of her son's murder. At her sentencing, Direnzo Whitehead offered a brief, simple statement of remorse, telling the court, "I'm so sorry," words that did little to soften the consequences of what she had done, but perhaps reflected some dawning recognition of the magnitude of her actions, once removed from the desperation that had consumed her at the time of the killing. The court sentenced her to life in prison, the maximum consequence available for the murder of her son. Ruth Direnzo Whitehead remains imprisoned in Pennsylvania as of 2025, a mother whose financial desperation and distorted sense of mercy led her to take the life of the very child she claimed to be protecting. Her case stands as a sobering reminder of how severe psychological and financial strain can warp even a parent's most fundamental instincts into something destructive and irreversible. Leslie A. Nelson. In 1995, in Haddon Heights, New Jersey, a routine law enforcement operation turned into a deadly confrontation that would leave 2 police officers dead and raise difficult questions about mental illness, identity, and the limits of the justice system's response to violence against its own. Leslie A. Nelson, born Glenn and later in life having transitioned, opened fire on officers who had arrived at a residence to execute a lawful search warrant. The officers, whose names were not disclosed, had come to carry out a legitimate function of law enforcement, the kind of operation conducted countless times across the country without incident. But Nelson did not view their arrival as a routine matter. Armed with an AK-47, a weapon capable of inflicting devastating damage, Nelson opened fire on the officers as they attempted to execute the warrant, killing both of them in the resulting gunfire. In the aftermath of the shooting, a clearer picture began to emerge of the psychological state that had preceded the violence. Nelson had documented mental health struggles, including depression and paranoia, conditions that investigators and mental health professionals believed had significantly contributed to a distorted perception of the officer's presence. Rather than seeing law enforcement executing a routine warrant, Nelson appeared to have viewed the officers as existential threats, a paranoid delusion that ultimately provided the justification for opening fire with a weapon designed for war rather than self-defense. The case moved through the New Jersey court system, with prosecutors pursuing the most severe punishment available under the law at the time. Nelson was initially sentenced to death for the killing of the 2 officers, a sentence that reflected both the severity of the crime and the fact that law enforcement officers had been the victims. For a time, it appeared that Nelson would face execution for the killings. However, the death sentence did not stand. On appeal, the sentence was vacated, and Nelson's punishment was changed to life imprisonment instead. This legal shift occurred against the backdrop of broader changes in New Jersey's approach to capital punishment. The state would eventually abolish the death penalty entirely, a development that made the question of Nelson's potential execution moot, regardless of how the appeal had been decided. Even had the original sentence been upheld, New Jersey's later abolition of capital punishment would have made carrying it out impossible. Today, Leslie A. Nelson remains incarcerated at Edna Mayan Correctional Facility, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. The case remains a stark example of how untreated mental illness, when combined with access to powerful weapons and a paranoid break from reality, can result in the deaths of law enforcement officers simply doing their jobs, and how the legal system's own evolution on capital punishment can alter the ultimate consequences faced by even the most violent offenders. Rita Gluzman. On April 6, 1996, in Pearl River, New York, a marriage that had reached its bitter end culminated in one of the most gruesome killings to ever be connected to the New Jersey area. Rita Gluzman, born in 1948 in Ukraine, had been locked in a contentious divorce from her husband, Jaclyn Dioro, a process that apparently pushed her toward a level of violence and calculation that shocked investigators once the full scope of her crime came to light. Rather than carry out the killing herself, Gluzman enlisted the help of her own cousin, recruiting him into a plan to murder Yakov in his Pearl River apartment. The weapon chosen for the killing was an axe, a brutal instrument that left no ambiguity about the violence involved in ending Yakov's life. Once her husband was dead, Gluzman's actions took an even darker turn. She dismembered his body, a horrific act intended to make disposal easier and identification more difficult. The dismembered remains were then transported across state lines and dumped into the Passaic River in New Jersey, an attempt to scatter evidence of the crime across multiple jurisdictions and complicate any investigation that might follow. For a time, it seemed the plan might succeed in obscuring what had happened to Jaclyn Gluzman, but the river eventually surrendered its secrets. Remains believed to belong to Jaclyn were discovered, setting off an investigation that would ultimately trace the killing back to his estranged wife. Investigators recovered Gluzman's laptop, which contained evidence connecting her to the planning of the murder. Toolmark analysis conducted on the axe used in the killing matched the wounds found on the recovered remains, providing forensic confirmation of the murder weapon. Beyond the physical evidence, investigators uncovered Gluzman's own threats made during the divorce proceedings, statements that established a clear motive rooted in her anger over the marriage's dissolution. The case carried particular legal significance beyond its grisly details. Rita Gluzman became the first woman ever convicted under the Violence Against Women Act, a landmark legal distinction that placed her case in the history books regardless of the brutal circumstances surrounding it. She was sentenced to federal life imprisonment, a punishment that at the time suggested she would spend the remainder of her days behind bars. That outcome, however, did not come to pass in the way the original sentence implied. In 2020, Gluzman was granted compassionate release, a decision driven by her advancing age and declining health rather than any change in the facts of her crime. She now lives in Hackensack, New Jersey, under supervision, a free woman in her old age despite having orchestrated the axe murder and dismemberment of her husband decades earlier. Her case remains a striking example of how time, age, and the mechanisms of compassionate release can ultimately soften even the harshest sentences handed down for the most brutal crimes.